Ma'am, we both know you don't belong in a place like this. Same routine every morning. Buy the cheapest thing on the menu. Sit by the window. Make people uncomfortable. Officer, I have receipts for every cup of coffee I've ever bought here in 11 years. Receipts don't mean loyalty. They mean you're cheap and you're stalling. Officer Dale Rusk reached down and snatched the folded napkin from her trembling hand, the one she used to wipe the rim of her cup. Sergeant Wendell Maddox stood behind her wheelchair, arms crossed, blocking the aisle like a wall of blue. Nobody in Ferris Hollow knew that the quiet man reading the newspaper in the corner booth was a retired lieutenant colonel, and nobody, least of all him, knew that the old woman about to be dragged out in front of everyone owned the very building they were standing in. Before this story unfolds, leave a comment with the city you're watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow brings another story you won't want to miss. Geraldine Folks had been awake since 4:30 that morning, same as every morning for the past 40 years, give or take the years her knees had finally given out and forced her into the chair. The alarm clock on her nightstand was older than her granddaughter. Its red numbers burned faintly into the dark of the bedroom, glowing 4:31 when she opened her eyes without needing it to ring. Some habits didn't care about arthritis or a busted hip or the fact that she didn't technically have anywhere she had to be. The body remembered. The body got up. She lay there a moment longer than she used to, letting the aches settle into something manageable before she reached for the bar bolted to the wall beside her bed, the one her nephew had installed 2 years back when the falls started getting scarier than the loneliness. Her fingers found the cool metal, and she pulled herself upright, breath catching the way it always did, a small, private negotiation between her body and her will that nobody else ever witnessed. The house on Larkspur Lane had been her mother's before it was hers, a narrow shotgun-style place with a tin roof that sang during storms and floorboards that knew every step she'd ever taken across them. She'd been born 2 streets over, in a hospital that didn't exist anymore, and she'd buried her mother, her husband, and her younger brother all from the front parlor of this house, because that was how it was done back then, before funeral homes became the only acceptable place to grieve. What almost nobody in Ferris Hollow knew, because Geraldine had never once mentioned it to a soul outside her own family, was that she also owned roughly a third of the commercial real estate on Founders Street, including the very diner she visited every single morning. Her late husband Theodore had been a quiet, meticulous man who drove a delivery truck for 31 years and spent every spare dollar buying up storefronts nobody wanted back when the town was sliding into decline. Buildings that sat empty for a decade before the city started talking about revitalization. He used to say that dignity was a kind of property, too, the kind you couldn't let the bank repossess. Geraldine still owned every brick of it, managed quietly through a holding company with a name nobody bothered to look up, because nobody imagined the woman drinking the cheapest coffee on the menu could possibly be the landlord. She didn't go to May Lou's diner because she needed to. She went because her husband used to take her there every Sunday after church for 38 years, and some part of her still expected to see him in the corner booth with his hat on the table and the crossword folded to the half-finished puzzle. Going there kept something alive that she wasn't ready to let die. It cost her $2.12 for black coffee and a biscuit, and it cost her something heavier than money to sit there alone, but she paid both prices without complaint, because complaining had never gotten anybody anywhere in her experience. Her nephew Donnell had offered, more than once, to drive her somewhere nicer, somewhere with cushioned booths and a menu that didn't have coffee rings burned into the laminate. She always told him the same thing. This is where her husband's ghost still pulled out her chair. He didn't argue after the 3rd time. He understood, the way young people sometimes surprised her by understanding things they'd never lived through. The wheelchair had come into her life 18 months ago, after a fall on the back steps that shattered her hip in a way the surgeons described with more confidence than the outcome ever justified. She'd fought the chair the way she'd fought most things in her life, with a stubbornness that her mother used to call folks' blood. But eventually her body made the decision for her the way bodies do. She'd cried exactly once about it, alone, at 2 in the morning, and then she'd never cried about it again, because there was no version of crying that put her back on her feet and she had things to do with the years she had left. 3 blocks from her house, in a duplex that smelled permanently of motor oil and her landlord's cigarettes. Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Verity sat at his kitchen table at 5 in the morning, doing the same thing he did every morning since his retirement 8 months ago, which was nothing, and hating every minute of it. 26 years in the Army had trained him for 100 different kinds of crisis, but nobody had trained him for a kitchen table with nothing on it but a cooling cup of coffee and a silence so total he sometimes spoke out loud just to hear a voice in the room. He'd served 3 combat tours, earned a chest full of ribbons he kept in a drawer instead of a frame, and walked away with a knee that announced every change in weather like a broken radio and a sleep schedule that never quite reset to civilian time. His wife had passed 4 years earlier, while he was still overseas, and he'd come home to a house that felt like a museum exhibit of a life he used to have. He didn't talk about that part. Soldiers learned early that some doors didn't need opening twice. What brought him to Mei Lu's diner most mornings wasn't hunger so much as the simple architecture of a public place, the comfort of being around other human beings, without the obligation of speaking to any of them. He'd sit in the corner booth with a newspaper he barely read and a coffee he let go cold, watching the rhythms of a town trying to find its footing again after the textile plant closed and took half its jobs with it. He liked Geraldine Folks immediately, though he'd never said more than a polite good morning to her, because she had the same quality he recognized in the best soldiers he'd commanded, the kind of steadiness that didn't announce itself, that simply showed up day after day and did what needed doing. That particular Tuesday, the diner was unusually full for the hour, an overflow of early shift nurses from the regional hospital, and a cluster of retired railroad men arguing about a ball game nobody under 60 cared about. Geraldine had wheeled herself to her usual spot by the window, ordered her coffee and biscuit from a waitress named Tasha, who'd worked there long enough to know the order before Geraldine spoke it, and settled in to watch the street wake up. Same as every other morning of her life. What she didn't know, because the owner of Mei Lu's, a nervous man named Garrett Fenwick, had been informed only the day before, was that a delegation from a development firm called Crestbrook Partners was touring Founders Street that very week, evaluating the corridor for what their glossy brochure called strategic revitalization investment. Garrett had been visited the prior afternoon by 2 city code officers who suggested, in the careful language officials use when they mean something else entirely, that the block needed to present well for the visiting investors. Specifically, they mentioned that loitering, panhandling, and what they termed non-paying lingerers should be discouraged in the days leading up to the tour. Garrett didn't think of Geraldine Folks as a loiterer. She bought something every single visit and tipped better than half his regular customers. But the code officers had also mentioned, almost as an aside, that the Ferris Hollow Police Department had agreed to do compliance walks along Founders Street that week, and Garrett, who had 3 kids and a mortgage and absolutely no appetite for confrontation with either the city or the police, simply nodded and said nothing and hoped the problem would resolve itself without him having to do anything at all. It did not resolve itself. At 7:15, the bell above the diner door jingled, and 2 uniformed officers walked in with the unhurried confidence of men who'd never once questioned whether a room belonged to them. Officer Dale Rusk led, a broad man in his early 50s whose belly strained against his duty belt, his face permanently arranged in an expression of mild contempt for whatever he happened to be looking at. Behind him came Sergeant Wendell Maddox, younger, leaner, with the kind of restless energy that made people instinctively step out of his path before he asked them to. The conversations in the diner didn't stop exactly, but they quieted, the way conversations do in the presence of armed authority. A lowering of volume that has nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with instinct. Rusk's eyes swept the room and landed on Geraldine the way a hawk's eyes land on something small and slow-moving in a field. He nudged Maddox with his elbow and tilted his head toward the window booth. They crossed the diner with unhurried steps, the kind that made it clear they expected no resistance and anticipated none. Rusk stopped beside Geraldine's table, close enough that his shadow fell directly across her coffee cup. "Morning, ma'am," he said in a tone that contained no warmth whatsoever. "We've had some complaints about people loitering on this block. You been here a while? I've been a customer of this diner for 11 years, Officer Geraldine said. Her voice steady, the voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime not raising it. I have a biscuit and a coffee in front of me that I paid for. That's so. Rusk's eyes moved to the small purse on her lap, then back to her face. You got a receipt for that? She did. She always kept her receipts, an old habit from decades of careful bookkeeping, and she reached into her purse with steady fingers and produced the small slip of paper, holding it up for him to see. He took it from her hand, glanced at it for less than a second, and let it fall to the floor beside her wheelchair wheel. Could be from any day, he said. Doesn't prove you're not just camping out here every morning bothering paying customers. I am a paying customer. You're sitting in a wheelchair by the window where every car on Founders Street can see you, ma'am, and we've had complaints about the appearance of this block. I'm going to need you to finish up and head on out. Sergeant Maddox had drifted around to the back of her wheelchair during the exchange, positioning himself there with his hand resting on his radio, close enough that she could feel his presence at her back without turning to look. Where exactly is it you'd be heading, ma'am? He asked, a faint smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. You got a ride coming, or is this where you sit till somebody feels sorry enough to wheel you home? I have lived 3 blocks from this diner my entire life, young man, Geraldine said, and for the first time her voice carried an edge beneath the steadiness. I do not require anybody's pity to get home. Then maybe you ought to get on home now, Rusk said, before this turns into something neither one of us wants it to turn into. In the corner booth, Malcolm Verity had gone very still, the newspaper lowered to his lap, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding 8 feet away with the particular attention of a man who had spent his career reading the early signs of a situation about to go wrong. He'd watched plenty of men posture with authority they didn't fully understand the weight of, and something in his chest, some old and familiar coil of tension, began to wind tight. Rusk reached down and put his hand on the armrest of Geraldine's wheelchair, not gripping it, but resting there with a casual proprietary weight that made the gesture feel like a threat dressed up as patience. Ma'am, I'm not going to ask twice. Take your hand off her chair. The words came from the corner booth, quiet but carrying the particular clarity of a voice trained to be heard over engine noise and gunfire and chaos. Malcolm Verity was standing now, the newspaper discarded on the table behind him, his posture the unmistakable bearing of a man who had once commanded soldiers and had not forgotten how. Rusk turned, sizing him up with the lazy contempt of a man unaccustomed to being told what to do. This isn't your business, friend. Sit down. It became my business the second you put your hands on a woman in a wheelchair who hasn't done a single thing except drink coffee she paid for. You want to make this a problem, old man? I'm not old, Malcolm said, taking one step closer, his bad knee protesting silently beneath him, and I'm not your friend. I'm asking you one more time to step back from her chair. Maddox moved then, coming around from behind Geraldine with his hand sliding off his radio and hovering somewhere closer to his belt, his eyes hard and assessing. You really want to do this in front of all these people? I'd rather not do it at all, Malcolm said. That's entirely up to you. What happened next took less than 11 seconds, though several witnesses would later describe it as feeling much longer. Rusk made the mistake of grabbing Malcolm's forearm, intending to push him back toward his booth, and Malcolm, 26 years of training overriding 8 months of civilian rust, redirected the grip with a fluid economy of motion that put Rusk off balance and against the counter before the man fully understood what had happened. Maddox lunged forward with his baton already coming free of its ring, and the strike caught Malcolm across the ribs hard enough to drop most men to their knees. Malcolm did not go to his knees. He absorbed it, staggered half a step, and put himself bodily between the officers and Geraldine's wheelchair, his arms raised not in aggression but in the universal posture of a man saying enough. Stop, this ends now. Get on the ground, Maddox shouted, baton still raised. Get on the ground now. I am not resisting, Malcolm said, his voice carrying that same unnatural steadiness, the calm of a man who had been shouted at by people far more dangerous than 2 small-town police officers. I am standing between you and a disabled woman you were about to physically remove from a building she has every legal right to occupy. Arrest me if you intend to. I am not moving. A young woman near the counter had her phone raised, recording, hands trembling but the camera steady. Her name was Priya Chandrasekaran, a third-year nursing student who picked up breakfast shifts at the diner to cover her tuition gap, and she would later say she didn't decide to film so much, as her hands simply did it without consulting the rest of her, because what she was watching felt like something the world needed to see. Rusk, breathing hard, straightened himself off the counter and looked at Malcolm with the particular fury of a man who has just been publicly bested and knows everyone in the room watched it happen. "You just assaulted an officer," he said. "You're done. You hear me? You're done. I redirected your grip so you wouldn't fall into the napkin dispenser," Malcolm said. "There's a young woman with a phone who I suspect captured every second of it, including the part where your partner struck an unarmed man defending a woman in a wheelchair." The color drained slightly from Rusk's face, though his posture didn't soften. "Cuff him," he said to Maddox, and within 90 seconds Malcolm Verity, retired lieutenant colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, 26 years of honorable service, was being walked out of May Lou's diner in handcuffs while Geraldine Folks sat frozen in her wheelchair, her hands pressed against her mouth, watching a man she barely knew take a beating and an arrest on her behalf. "Wait," she said, finally finding her voice, wheeling herself forward with as much speed as her arms could manage. "Wait, this is wrong. He didn't do anything. I'm telling you he didn't." "Ma'am, you need to step back," Maddox said, not looking at her, already pushing Malcolm toward the door. "I am not stepping back from an injustice happening in front of my own eyes," Geraldine said, and something in her voice made even Rusk pause for half a second. "I have lived in this town for 63 years. I have never in my life seen anything as shameful as what just happened in here, and I want both your badge numbers, and I want them now." Rusk gave her his badge number with the bored contempt of a man certain it would mean nothing. He was, as it turned out, profoundly mistaken about that. The diner erupted into noise the second the door closed behind the officers and Malcolm, voices rising over each other, some defending what they'd seen, a few quieter ones muttering that the old man should have minded his business. The particular babble of a small town trying to decide collectively what story it was going to tell itself about what just happened. Garrett Fenwick stood frozen behind the counter, his face the color of old dishwater, already calculating the cost of whatever was coming. Geraldine sat very still amid the chaos, her coffee gone cold in front of her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking, and made a decision that had been building in her for longer than that single morning. A decision rooted in 63 years of watching her town slowly forget how to treat its own people with basic decency. She was done being quiet about who she was. 3 days later, the Ferris Hollow Police Department issued a brief statement defending Officer Rusk and Sergeant Maddox's conduct, describing the incident as a routine compliance check that escalated due to the unprovoked aggression of a bystander. Malcolm Verity had spent 6 hours in a holding cell before his nephew, a public defender 2 counties over, managed to get him released on his own recognizance, charged with assaulting an officer and disorderly conduct, charges that could end what was left of his pension if a jury believed the department's version of events. Priya Chandrasekaran's video, however, had already found its way onto the internet, uploaded not by her but by a regular customer who'd asked to see it, and shared it without fully understanding what he was setting in motion. By Thursday evening it had been viewed several 100,000 times, the comments section a churning mixture of outrage, disbelief, and the particular fury reserved for footage that makes plain what so many people already suspected but rarely saw confirmed on camera. Geraldine watched the video 7 times in the privacy of her front parlor, her husband's old recliner creaking beneath her each time she shifted, studying the footage the way she used to study contracts before signing them. She saw with perfect clarity now that she could pause and rewind the moment Rusk let her receipt fall to the floor without truly looking at it. She saw Maddox's baton come down on a man who had done nothing but stand between an officer and an old woman. She saw her own face in the corner of the frame, frozen in an expression she didn't recognize as her own, something between fear and a fury that had been building for decades. She called her nephew Donnell that night and asked him to bring her the folder. Donnell Pruitt-Hale had been managing the legal and financial side of his aunt's holdings for nearly 6 years, ever since Theodore passed, and Geraldine decided she trusted family more than lawyers. even though Donnell happened to be both. He arrived at her house the next morning with a leather folder thick with deeds, leases, and the quiet architecture of 3 decades of careful, patient investment, and found his aunt sitting at her kitchen table in a blouse she usually saved for church. "Aunt Gary," he said, setting the folder down. "You sure about this? Once people know, they know. You can't put that back in the bottle. Donnell, I have spent 63 years in this town, letting people assume things about me because of what I look like sitting in a window with a cup of coffee. I let a man take a beating in my place because nobody in that diner imagined I was anybody worth protecting." She folded her hands on the table, her wedding ring catching the morning light. "I am done letting people assume. What exactly are you planning to do with it?" "I'm planning," she said, "to attend the City Council meeting on Founders Street redevelopment next Tuesday, and I am planning to remind this town exactly whose buildings they've been standing in." The Crestbrook Partners proposal had been the talk of Ferris Hollow for months, a glossy plan to redevelop 6 blocks of Founders Street into what their renderings called a mixed-use innovation corridor, complete with luxury apartments, a boutique hotel, and storefronts, priced well beyond what any of the current tenants could afford. The City Council, eager for the tax revenue and the ribbon-cutting photo opportunity, had been quietly fast-tracking approvals, and the compliance walks that put Geraldine and Malcolm in the path of Officer Rusk had been part of a broader, unofficial effort to make the corridor look more presentable for the investors touring it that week. What the council didn't fully understand, because Geraldine's holding company had always operated under the unassuming name Larkspur Properties LLC, was that nearly every storefront Crestbrook intended to acquire through eminent domain proceedings was already owned by the woman the police had tried to remove from a diner for loitering. The council chamber was packed the following Tuesday, word having spread through the town in the particular way. News travels in places small enough that everyone is 2 phone calls removed from everyone else. Malcolm Verity sat near the back, his ribs still wrapped beneath his shirt, watching with the wary attention of a man who'd learned the hard way not to trust rooms full of authority. Reporters from 2 regional news outlets had set up in the side aisle, drawn by the video that now had well over 1 million views. Crestbrook's lead attorney, a polished man named Bradford Stoll, was midway through his presentation on the corridor's transformative economic potential, when the chamber's side doors opened and Geraldine Folks wheeled herself down the center aisle, dressed in the navy blue suit she'd worn to her husband's funeral, her chin lifted in a way that made every head in the room turn to follow her progress. She rolled to a stop at the podium's accessible microphone, and the room, sensing something it couldn't yet name, fell into an attentive silence. "My name is Geraldine Folks," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's speakers. "Most of you know me, if you know me at all, as the old woman who drinks coffee at May Lou's. Last Tuesday, 2 of this city's police officers tried to remove me from that diner for the crime of sitting too long in a wheelchair by the window. A man named Malcolm Verity, a retired lieutenant colonel who served this country honorably for 26 years, stood between me and those officers, and he was beaten and arrested for it." A murmur moved through the room. Bradford Stoll shifted uncomfortably at his table. "What none of you knew, including the officers, including this council, is that I own the building that diner sits in. I own this one too, as it happens." She paused, letting that settle into the room. "My husband Theodore spent 31 years driving a delivery truck and every spare dollar he ever saved buying up Founders Street when none of you wanted it. I have the deeds in this folder, every single one, going back to 1987. Donnell stood and placed the thick folder on the table in front of the council, the documents inside meticulously organized, notarized, and unimpeachable. "I did not come here tonight to humiliate anyone," Geraldine continued, "though I will admit some part of me wanted to. I came here because I watched a good man get hurt protecting me, and because I have spent 6 decades in this town, watching people who look like me get treated as though our presence is an inconvenience to be managed rather than a life to be respected. I am formally withdrawing every single property I own from consideration in the Crestbrook redevelopment proposal, effective immediately, and Crestbrook's attorneys are welcome to review the deeds in this folder to confirm exactly how much of this corridor that removes from their plans." The chamber erupted. Voices rising over each other, Bradford Stoll already on his feet objecting to the unorthodox nature of the proceedings. But Geraldine wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am establishing the Theodore Folks Community Trust, funded with $30 million from my own holdings, to renovate and stabilize Founders Street under the control of the people who actually live and work here. And I am asking Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Verity, who put his body between me and harm without knowing a single thing about who I was, to serve as its founding director. Malcolm, in the back row, felt something in his chest unclench for the first time in 8 months. In the weeks that followed, the story moved beyond Ferris Hollow entirely, picked up by national outlets, drawn to the footage and the reveal that followed it. An internal affairs investigation into Officer Rusk and Sergeant Maddox uncovered a pattern of complaints stretching back years, complaints that had been quietly filed away by a department more interested in protecting its own than its citizens. Both men were terminated within a month, and the charges against Malcolm were dropped so quickly that even his nephew seemed surprised by the speed of it. Garrett Fenwick, shaken by his own complicity, sold May Lou's diner to a worker cooperative formed by his longtime staff, with Larkspur Properties quietly covering the difference between the sale price and what the employees could afford. A year later, the building on the corner of Founders and 3rd no longer sat empty. The Theodore Folks Community Trust had transformed it into a resource center with a legal aid office, a job training program for veterans, and a small clinic that saw patients regardless of their ability to pay. Malcolm Verity walked through its front doors most mornings before the sun was fully up. Old habits dying hard, his knees still complaining about the weather, but his hands finally finding work that felt like it mattered. Priya Chandrasekaran finished her nursing degree with a scholarship the trust established in her name, recognizing the courage it took to lift a phone when so many others simply watched. Tasha, the waitress who'd known Geraldine's order before she spoke it, now managed outreach for the Trust's food assistance program, connecting elderly residents with the kind of quiet dignity Geraldine had always believed people deserved. Geraldine still went to May Lou's most mornings, though the booths were new now and the coffee a little better than it used to be. She sat by the window in her usual spot, watching Founders Street slowly stitch itself back together, watching a town learn, however imperfectly, that the people it had spent decades overlooking had been holding it up the entire time. Malcolm joined her most days, sliding into the seat across from her with the same quiet ease he'd carried into that first confrontation, and they rarely spoke much. Two people who'd found in each other a kind of steadiness neither had expected to find again. One morning, watching a teenage boy help an elderly man across the street outside the window, his hand steady under the man's elbow, Geraldine smiled and said that dignity, once you saw it modeled, had a way of spreading on its own. Quiet as a habit nobody noticed they'd learned.